I'm here with Casores, the newly appointed head coach of the Toronto Defiant, of course. Finalist. Really a coach that has been around the block for a long time. I would say a coach that's probably more behind the scenes, and we hope that that changes now, being the face of the Toronto Defiant coaching staff. But generally speaking, of course, we're 2 weeks after the grand finals, right? Has it settled in yet? Where are your emotions with this?
Well, when it comes to the grand finals, after we lost to the Houston Outlaws, I feel like we really made like something great happen. I think, making it all the way to the finals, in series, somewhere close, but most were decisive, and we are really playing our game, and we are playing very strong compared to what the meta is for us, right? Like the strongest metas for us been where we had like two flex support, and we were playing a slower meta, so we really had to adjust and play like a really fast style, which is really wasn't our style all year. So being able to adapt after the Houston match and really coming together as a team was really great to see and make us make that run. But then of course in the finals, we were so close. I remember we were 2-1 up. We were like 90 meters to 40 on Esperanza, and then we had 4 ults in the bank. And we Kiriko ult, and they kite back like Dallas do so well always. And we throw in 2 more ults, and at that point I knew, oh no, we're choking. And we choked away the 90 to 40 lead because they had a bigger ult bank after their great kite back. And after that, we were 2-2 on a map we really should have won. And I think if we had won that Esperanza map, I mean, we could have picked Circuit later, which every team was scared against us on Circuit. Because Kaluja Sigma I think is the best in the league, and we have great sniper players too. So if we had won that map, I think we had the series in the bag. But we ended up losing it. We ended up making it super close in the end. But because they could pick the escort map, they could go to route, and that was one of our weaker maps. So, and of course, Dallas Fuel on push is very scary. So in the end, we won Oasis, but the momentum really turned in their favor, and I was a little bit. I have regrets over not being able to turn that momentum around again and come back in a map 7. But when it comes to Dallas Fuel, they have a lot of experience on the roster. Our guys were a lot less experienced. Of course, we have Violet and Striker, who brought a great deal of experience, especially Striker's calling. Ended up being very strong on the Reaper, just like he had done, in the Doomfist Reaper meta back in at the end of season 2. So he brought a lot of that veterancy. But we still had 3 rookies in the lineup. And in the end, the nerves kind of got to us, and the experience from the Dallas Fuel ended up triumphing.
Do you think it was just nerves, or was it also a little bit exhaustion? Because after all, that was pretty much a marathon day for you guys, right?
I definitely think the exhaustion played a big factor. We ended up doing really good against the Houston Outlaws, making that series as short as possible, luckily. So we ended up 3-0ing them. So I think coming into the finals, we had a lot of energy still, but when it come to maps 6 and 7, a lot of our guys, they said their eyes were starting to get dry, and because we had to get up a lot earlier than the Dallas Fuel as well, the day ended up going really late for us. So I'd say the level of exhaustion is a part of it, but I still feel like Dallas Fuel, especially on push maps, are just so incredibly strong. I don't think if we were like fully awake that we would have won Coliseum either. Just because their level of kiting back and pushing again is really good. And especially on push and cough, that's super important.
It sounds like you guys had to change your fates in some way. How confident did you enter the playoffs? Or did you think like you would make it to the grand final, have a serious shot at winning it all? Or did you struggle mostly in the run up to the finals week?
I would say in the run up, we were a top 4 team. We weren't we were going even with Glads, and we were like doing pretty good against teams like London, right? But it really depended on what the enemy team's style was, whether or not we did good against them in scrims. But I'd say in the playoffs, we leveled up a lot, right? Like, I mean, you saw it. We lost against the Houston Outlaws. We didn't really play like a team. And then after all that leveling for losers bracket, we faced them again. And I think we look like a completely different team because, we really started understanding the meta. we had a lot of keywords to cross over, our language barrier. And I think, everybody really figured out that this meta, we can't win by individual play. We have to make things and make rotations happen as a team. And, I think we did that as the second best team. I think Dallas, the Dallas Hive Mind did that better than us, but I think we did that as the second best team. And through individual play as well, especially, carry performances from Proper, we were able to, kind of use that team play plus Proper's play to beat out all these other teams.
Is there something that you could put it to in terms of who stepped up? Was it someone in particular or a thing in particular that happened that you turned it around?
I'd say it was the team as a whole. After we lost to the Houston Outlaws, everybody was really like, we should have never lost that match. If we, we're just on the same page, we would have won that match. And then after that, every round, every team meeting we had, every 3-2-1 before the map, we just said same page, so everybody knew, somebody makes a call, it's a bad call or a good call, you have to trust them, and we have to do it together. So I just started saying, it's weird, but 5 monkeys together is better than 5 smart players each doing their own thing. So we really started playing like a unit, I think, when it came to later things. And another thing, I can say this since, the playoffs is over now, and, I can give away some of our strategies. But another thing we started doing was every Winston would peek the enemy Sojourn and give charge shot, right? So what we would do is we would honestly start playing our Sojourn like an off tank and just a bait, and we would just hide our Winston and just not give them any Sojourn charge for every single neutral fight, and we'd really work on that. And Proper would say you guys hide here, I'm gonna go baiting. And he would bait and he would get his charge while the enemy Sojourn has a hard time getting charge because only our Sojourn speak and the rest is just hiding. So that was a big part of why we were able to get so many picks, especially against Outlaws, because both Kaluj and Mikey just weren't giving Merit any charge, while Proper was still getting a similar amount of charge, which is why I think Merit looked a lot worse in the series against us the second time around compared to the first, because we really started integrating that strategy into, the fights without ults.
Reviewing the grand finals, it felt like that was also something that Dallas was really good at. It felt like their pacing was exactly around the drop off or the cooldown of the Sojourn charge, not giving any surface area for Proper to maintain that charge, and then also just having gameplay beats around, basically oh my god, it's one shot range now, either drop a bubble and make a play or let it decay and whatnot. Was that the thing that unlocked this meta for the best teams?
Yeah, I feel like definitely playing around the Sojourn chart is very, very important. One thing that Dallas did really well, and I hope they don't mind me sharing this, but of course, they haven't told me. I just figured this out by watching them. It's every time Edison gets 100 charge, they look to make a dive or a play, and they look to grab space, right? So they'll grab 100 charge, and then Fearless will jump in, and they'll slide into the bubble and try to one-shot somebody. And most of the time, you won't even headshot them. He'll just body shot them, and then somebody else will finish them off, right? So it's a little bit opposite from what we were doing, since we are mostly looking to just keep spamming and keep, making them come to us. And I think later in the series, Dallas really adjusted and started playing as slow as us, because they figured, we keep getting baited on these earlier maps, especially Oasis. I think we managed to bait them a lot into making bad plays. So they just started forcing it a lot less and started just playing the cooldown trades, not diving, just cooldown trades. And they ended up, doing really good on that. I think their ult usage was really good, especially on Colosseo. So even in the slow play style, which they adopted later and they kept adapting, they started doing better.
Sure. Now, just to give viewers a holistic understanding, it sounds like you're very involved with strategy, but you're also just from your background, it feels like you're more also someone that is capable of creating an atmosphere in a team, or someone that is capable of giving the players a couple of things outside the game to manage stress, to workouts and whatnot might happen there, right? So could you Could you explain like what your way through the Overwatch League was and how you developed that particular skill set? Maybe also incorporating like stuff that you learned, outside the Overwatch ecosphere.
Right. Yeah, no, I think my start in Overwatch was really like I was a support player in contenders. So I really started out as a player, and I was the main shot caller on the team I was at in the time. It's called Team Disband. Uh, so so for the OGs there, there's that. But through that, I really started seeing things through how other players looked and how players' eyes looked. And then as things went on, I started getting asked for coaching jobs for several teams because they knew I was really smart about the game. My shot calling was really good. Just my in-game play, I was not as good, I will say. I think, especially in several metas, I was not as good. So I was really ready to like take that step back. And since the first team I coached, 1 point at the time, I like really enjoyed it, and the players really enjoyed working with me, right? And I think that's the biggest thing. Like I try to always see things from a player's perspective, try to ask them like inquisitive questions, and then try to figure out like make them figure out, where they need to go instead of just giving it on a silver platter. And I think that really worked well with that team. And they hadn't really been coached before that. So, as that team, started falling apart in the season 2 of the Overwatch League came around, a lot of teams, like there came a lot of expansion teams, 6 new expansion teams came in, and a lot of teams started doing these tryouts for coaches. And these were very wide tryouts because the expansion teams have been planned a while ago, and teams had a lot of time back then. So I got invited to the Atlanta Reign tryout with I think about 40 other coaches at the time, and it was quite an extensive tryout process where they had coaches analyze like a couple of VODs and then had them write up like how you do individual players and then also do macro. And I ended up doing the best out of that, or with a couple of other coaches. I ended up having an interview with them. And from there, they hired me as a player development coach, right? So coming from a professional player to player development coach, I was really there to work one-on-one with the players and make them also feel heard and at ease in the team, right? It wasn't just, you have to use X skill better, you have to do that better. It was more like, how can I help you grow and what should you work on as like a consensus? And then we'd set goals every month, right? And we come back to look at those goals and see what we really achieved. And I think that worked very well. And I think Atlanta Reign for the first season we ended 6th place. Of course, with me, Steffi, and our assistant coach Silence, who was remote. And I think through that I really learned how you should manage players because I worked so much with the players. I learned, what makes them tick, what doesn't make them tick, and was really able to take that. And then, of course, in season 3, toward the middle/end of it, I was hired as an analyst for the Shock. And I came in mostly remote where I learned to do more macro work, right? Because before that, I was doing a lot of streams. I was doing a ton of VOD reviews. I was doing write-ups. Like I was putting in a lot of work just to make my macro knowledge level up to that individual knowledge that I already had from being a player and being a player performance coach. And then, through that work with the Shock, I think I really learned like, the rotations because it ended up being, the Winston meta at first with the Sombra Reaper back when we played Philly and, all these other teams had made the run through to, the eventual playoffs in Korea. And that really depended on, where does my Reaper play? Where does my Sombra play on this map? Where does the enemy team Sombra put their translocator? Is that a good spot? Can we punish that? That sort of stuff is really what they were looking for from the analyst side. So I was really like focusing on ult management, rotations, what the enemy team does really well. Can we steal it? How do we beat it? I think that's all very important sides. I made a lot of write-ups based on that, handed them over to Krusty and the team at the time, and I think they used those a lot. And then we went into the Roadhog meta, so everything basically changed, and I more had to figure out what angles we should take for our snipers. What angles does the enemy team take? where on this map should we rotate? Can we pull off any cheese? Like I remember very distinctly, we had this one cheese I came up with on Anubis, where of course Anubis isn't a game anymore, so I can tell you guys about this. But where we would instead of doing what every other team does, where they go like left side and then they fake it and then jump the top or fake it and go to the point, we would rotate to the top right, put down a bubble, and then most teams, when they do that, they just drop the point and sit there and make the enemy team come, right? So the enemy team would always set up to counter you going to point. So I had our team sit on the mega pack on Anubis top right, wait for our Winston bubble to come off cooldown because we'd use that for the rotation, and then we'd speed through the window. Our Winston would jump as far as he can, and our Reaper would TP above them, like through the castle top, and he would drop on top of them, and we'd catch every single team out with this. And it was a really good like cheese strat because the smaller maps didn't lend to the double sniper that well. So I think through different strategies like that and being a little more creative, I learned a lot in the analyst work. And I think of course Shock also liked what I did a lot, so they hired me as an assistant coach on site for season 4, and then of course season 5 subsequently. And what I really learned through my time with the Shock and working under Krusty and eventually also working under 9K, with 9K, it's that coaching. I'd say, as an assistant coach, you can really focus on the strategy and helping the players and doing the micro and doing the macro. For a head coach, I'd say it's mostly about player management and, what do our bench players need to do and how do I make the team feel heard and, how do I value and weigh up all these different opinions and then make a decision in the end. I think, as a head coach, you're the main decision maker on a team. And, we're going to talk about it later too, but coming to Defiant, that's one of the things that I'm looking to bring in.
Was it a little bit different sides of the spectrum? Because, I mean, we know that for the Atlanta Reign and Sephi teams in general, they are always very player-led. Like, I think Sephi excels at building teams, also beating the market on these Western players and like just assembling really strong rosters and making them click across the season, while probably not necessarily, having all the pocket strats like you're doing, right? I think especially like it's interesting how you point out these cheese strategies. I think some very good teams probably think more in terms of heuristics other than, hard rollouts, how things should be played, right? So it sounds like the Shock always has, a more rigid structure, at least than the Reign. Is there this dichotomy? Is it the two ends of the spectrum?
Well, I would say, yeah, definitely my time on Atlanta, it was more of a horizontal structure, right? Where everybody, got their say and, everybody has like equal value. I'd say, Sephi is, like you said, really, really good at making a team. And he does a really good job at scouting players. I'd say on the Shock, of course, I think we did a good job scouting players. I mean, I won't, we shouldn't take too much credit for scouting proper or something, Yeah. But I think, across the years, especially Krusty's done a good job. I'd say on the Shock, it's definitely more of a top-down where, Krusty makes the decisions. The assistant coaches, we advise and we help and we, assist where we can, and then we come to a conclusion. But it's not like I would say it's a dictatorship. I'd say everybody still gets their word in, everybody gets listened to, and I think a lot of people have this view of the Shock where it's just Krusty making all the decisions, and it almost being like Krusty who coaches everybody. But I'd say especially on the Shock, this year I'd say a lot of people got their say, and we function more as the if you have the scale from like a player-led team to coach-led team, I'd say we are about 75% coach-led. I wouldn't say it was all coach decisions. Player got their say. But if you look toward maybe Atlanta, it's definitely more, toward the middle or back end of the scale. Of course, I haven't been on Atlanta for a while, but that was my experience when I was there. So yeah, I'd say we're definitely a more coach-driven team than most teams in the league.
For sure. Now, Last year, I interviewed Face, also before the season, and he, of course, just had taken over from Depay, stepping into a head coach position for the first time, other than, drop airs, which probably is a different scale than an Overwatch League team, right? And I asked him back then, like, do you feel ready for the head coach position? And he said yes. And then afterwards, in the second interview, I asked him, were you ready? And he was like, yes, but I had to learn so much. Do you feel ready?
I would say I'm ready as I could ever be. I've been, an analyst, an assistant coach, a player development coach. I've seen I've seen all sides of the spectrum, right? I think, this is the next step in my career, and I'll of course have to learn a lot throughout the season. But I think, the most things I've learned from Krusty, from Sefi, is how to manage players, and how to make things function, even in a mixed team, right? Which I think we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I think I'm confident and I'm as ready as I'll ever be. But I also realize, during this season, I'll have to learn a lot to make this work.
Do you have a particular thing that you want to hone in on? Because, okay, let me run an idea by you. I think a lot of the best head coaches in the league have created these talent funnels for themselves, where it's not just that they're, building a team that can work for one season. They have a system that continuously feeds them the best players. I'm thinking of Moon having these, long-reaching connections to Fate, a player he coached in Apex, right? That, like, Izayaki, like all the Team CC guys. Then I'm looking at Moon. That's the whole Mystic arc. With Krusty, we know, like, he was always, very hands-on with O2 stuff, even, extending there. Brad, who always had, like, his feelers in the NA scene. Is this something that you think, like, every top coach in the league has to have that funnel where, you can establish, okay, the best players from a particular region will come to me?
Well, I definitely feel like it helps. I think, if you've worked with players and you know how they function in a team, that helps you, like, going forward, and like, at least a baseline value you'll get out of that player. Now, of course, I think, there's been teams built that don't have just a funnel from previous teams, but I think, bringing what and bringing some new, like, talent into that as well, where already these personalities won't bounce, or you have, like, a baseline that you can trust. I think that's the value that it brings, right? I don't necessarily think that these coaches bring the players because they've worked with them before. I think because they're a known quantity and they know they're going to bring value to the team, it's always worked for them, right? Example, we brought Striker this year because we had a known quality that he had leadership and experience, and we felt we needed more leadership and experience. So I think, throughout my years in the league and Krusty years in the league and Moon's years in the league, we've worked with these players where we know what they're going to bring. And then if you feel like a team needs that, you can bring them in, maybe even from another team, just because you see the value and you've seen that value that they're going to bring.
For sure. Now, once again, it hasn't been long since the end of the league. There had been this tweet with you and Twilight where you guys shook hands somewhere outside and went like, he has signed the contract, sort of like establishing the Defiant situation. Was that actually when you first got interested in the Toronto Defiant, or how long have these negotiations gone on for?
I mean, of course, at the time, I didn't have, like, any interest, like, in the Defiant particularly, right? We just, me and Twilight have been friends for a long time, and of course we were on the team, the year before that in season 4. So we went on a hike together, and we just took that picture, and he made the caption, and due to sheer coincidence, it ended up, I ended up on the Defiant. Sadly, he's not on the Defiant anymore, but I think it's a funny coincidence, and looking back at it now, I think I commented something like, "Yeah, I've been signed as your personal trainer," and actually since then, I think he lost like 20 pounds or so,
Wow.
maybe even more since his time in Defiant. So, not that I did anything toward that.
Right.
I think I gave him advice like once, but It's funny looking back how things happen sometimes.
Right. So is this a recent development, or did you know that you were going to go for the head coach position somewhere, or like that it was definitely going to be the defined?
I knew after, our second or third LAN that I wanted to try for a head coach position after this year because I feel like, I've been developing for so long. I've learned a lot. If I don't do it this year, then I'm never gonna be ready. So I really wanted to step up this year, whether it was gonna be with the Defiant or another team. I wasn't quite sure. But I think things fell into place, and I think Defiant is one of the best homes I can find myself on. So all Lego blocks ended up in place.
Sure. Now, as every team this year, there have been some announcements in terms of the rosters. How much say did you have so far in the roster movement?
Um, That's tough to say. I'd say at the very start, of course, some decisions had already been made. Like with Twilight, I didn't have any say into it. He had already decided for himself what he was going to do. But I'd say since then, I have a lot of autonomy in what we're gonna do with this roster and how we're gonna look ahead. So I'd say, especially for our future signings, if I don't want it, it won't happen. And if I really want it, it will probably happen. Of course, we still have a manager and ownership group who have been super supportive. But whatever I decide, I'll run by them, and then we'll talk about it and we'll figure out if it can happen or not. But especially now, since I just got made head coach, they really want to put me in a position to succeed where I can build my own roster and shape this season for the team and for myself.
It's interesting, like when you talk to specifically general managers, at this point, they have a couple of ideas that they can go down, and then none of them ever come true, right? Like to that extent. Of course, increasingly, like a high percentage of wishes come true for the top paying. Like if you're someone with the gladiators, you're probably at least getting some of your first picks, right? For other teams, in the midfield, that could be a little bit more challenging. Is that your experience? Do you think that's true? And do you think this will be a specific challenge in the Defined? Because it feels like, for instance, when I talked to Christopher last year, he was like, my first goal with London is that people want to come to London because currently that's an issue for me.
Right. Yeah, no, of course. The Defiant hasn't had the greatest past seasons. I think, their last season was one of their better seasons. But, if I am, like, let's put ourselves in the player's shoes here. If I am a top player and I have a pick of any team, would Defiant be my first pick? Probably not, right? I'd look at Shock, Gladiators, teams that are more well established, that have won championship, that have won titles. Those would probably be my first picks. So there's definitely a challenge we have to face. And I think, this next season, as a Defiant, we're definitely going to try to, work for the long term and bring some of that repertoire back. Show these people that the Defiant can do really good and can win, and that it really should be a home for these players. Now, that's not to say, we can't get any of our A tier picks. It just means, we have to work for them harder and make sure, they regain some trust in the Defiant. Of course, through new leadership, through me coming in, and hopefully through building that trust back up. And that might not be a 1 year thing, that might be a long-term thing, but that is really something, we're looking, just like maybe Christopher had last year, something we're working toward this year where, the top tier players, the A tier talent can see again that, the Defiant is working for those, top tier spots.
For sure. Now, once again, like that situation might require you guys to, be a little bit flexible. It's 2 days, I believe, until the transfer market opens, and you're confronted with reality. Have you talked through what kind of, let's say, roster building paradigms you're happy to make? For instance, what about hybrid rosters?
Right. Yeah, so I have learned Korean ever since 2019. I wouldn't say I'm fluent in Korean, but I can understand about 70 to 80% when people are talking, and I can speak. My speaking's a little bit slow, but I think, through these years and through working with Korean players and having always been on mixed teams, ever since season 2. I've learned how to navigate these mixed rosters, and I'm confident, even if we're making a mixed roster, that we can make it succeed. So it's definitely an option I'm considering.
What do you think is the key to making make hybrid rosters work?
I feel like it is mostly on the culture within the team, right? Like what you'll find most times is that the cultures between the Western side and the Korean side bounce, just because usually the Korean or the Western side, their values in what a coach needs to bring, or what each tier needs to bring to the team, or how you effectively communicate doesn't align, as well as just not being able to communicate with your teammates a lot. That's just frustrating, right? Like if I'm in a game and I'm trying to make a call out to my Western player, but he doesn't understand me and does something completely different, I would also get frustrated, right? So it's about making people feel heard and aligning them. I'd say one thing that I said earlier, for example, is making a lot of keywords where the players are on the same page, even though there's a language barrier, just because of that keyword. So it's really about making the cultures align outside of game, and making the Western players see the Korean players' perspective, and the Korean players see the Western players' perspective. And I'd say one of the biggest things that contributed to the Shock success is having two bilingual coaches, having both Krusty and 9K, be able to translate for the Western and the Korean players. And while we do feedback sessions, what would happen a lot of the time is I would be doing feedback, or 9K would be doing feedback, and then Krusty would be standing in the back, either translating it, to Western and Korean in real time, so people can actually respond to what's going on. When a team has a translator, a lot of the time, what ends up happening is, things get explained in one language, players respond to it, and then that as a whole gets translated in like a big blob for the other side, which then they can't even respond anymore, which is just, that is frustrating, right? So I think the biggest way to circumvent that is, having people translate in real time, having people understand both sides of the perspective, and, bringing that to the other side. And, I think one of the things that helped the Shock a lot this year too is that we were all in a team house. So, people had to get along almost, and they had to, you're spending so much time a day with somebody, you do get to know them. And I think, once people really get to know each other, that language barrier falls a lot. And I think, especially when a team's doing badly, that, culture difference and that language barrier can really, result in the divide. But I think, one of the keys to make it work is just making both sides see each other's perspective and trying to figure things out as a team, while, having effective communication between the two sides.
For sure. Now you mentioned the topic of keywords twice now. So now I got to ask, because I'm personally also very interested. I think not just for teams, but also for the wider audience, like having a really cool term can help a lot with understanding. So do you have like a keyword that the Shock used in order to get on the same page?
I'd say like something we use in the playoffs is this one keyword, flip. And what it means is we're going to jump over them with our Winston bubble. Our Kiriko is going to TP to our Winston while our Sojourn slides through, and our Lucio wall rides and speed boost, and we're going to take the other side of the map all of a sudden, So it's a lot of things that we talked about, and it's all converted in this one keyword called flip. And basically we flip the sides of the map, which makes sense, but all the intricacies of it and how each person needs to move, that was key. And we do this at times where they would, for example, use a Kiriko, or they would use a Winston bubble, and we saw like an opportunity to grab most of the map and grab the good space of the map. And we'd call this, and everybody would be on the same page. I think keywords like that really help, like mixed rosters especially.
For sure. Now, this next question is an interesting topic, also because it seems to be large disagreements in terms of other head coaches. So first, I got the idea talking to Dip, and he said like 85 to 95% of the outcome of the season is determined probably by how you build your roster. So, or maybe not even the season, but also how each individual match comes out. Now, I talked to Ganba, and he said, I feel like for my teams, from personal experience, that percentage is significantly lower. I feel like I have at least 30, maybe more % chance of impacting the match, with coaching or someone bringing up an idea. What do you think? What's your percentage? How much is predetermined in terms of like who you send on the server, and how much is, coaching or player input?
I think it depends on where you are in the season. I would say, personally, if I had to give it a number, I'd say I'm more aligned on the Gumba side, where maybe it's like, scouting is definitely one of the most important jobs a team does. It affects your whole season. And a big part of scouting is too making personalities align, right? It's not just getting the star players, it's also making a team that is going to work in the long run. And with that, also comes, how coachable is the team. So I think honestly for me, it depends on team per team, right? If you've got a lot of rookie players, right, I think you have a bigger impact as a coach because they're more likely to listen to you. But if you've got a lot of star players, right, I'd say it's more the scouting you do and the caliber of the star players and how well they work together. So I think it depends, right? If you've got a lot of people year one, haven't won a lot of championships, let's say it's London, right? I think with a team like London, some of them already had experience, some of them didn't. But I'd say you have a bigger impact as a coach on a team like London than a team like Glads, for example, who have a lot of star players who already have been through a couple of seasons. And your scouting and making the roster gel as a whole matters more. So I would say, that is a big difference. But if I had to give it an arbitrary number, I'd say, the scouting is probably 70%. And then, the results above that, I'd say it's about 30% of what you can make during the season. But I think that scale changes based on how experienced your roster is and how coachable they are.
For sure. Now, not that many more days to do for the FA window to open. And of course, we understand you can't talk about specifics, but, rough philosophy in terms of the roster building, that's interesting. So, for instance, we had some learnings of how you could probably build Overwatch 2 rosters. A lot changed. It felt like rookies this year were far more valuable in past years, right? Presumably because the game changed so much, and whatever experience, the value of that was a little bit diminished over time. What do you think generally? How many players do you want per role? And maybe also, how much veterancy do you want?
I think there definitely needs to be a shine in veterancy on the team. But I would also say, especially for roles like flex DPS, right? There's gonna be, so much shift in metas, and I think, a lot of new characters are gonna get added now that Overwatch 2 comes out. I think if you were to ask a bunch of coaches right now, they probably value like a player that's malleable, that's a rookie, that's young, a lot more than maybe 2 seasons ago when it was just the same meta, no characters got added, no new maps. So I feel like that's why in Overwatch 2, rookies kind of shined this year because they are able to adapt quicker to a whole new game compared to veterans. Now I think especially when you look at the shock, the veterans are also what carried us in the end. Striker's experience, for example, was able to lead us to that second place. So I think there needs to be a balance between the two. I think some veterancy on the roster, really valuable, right? Especially through calling, through keeping the team calm in pressure situations, and through a degree of leadership that, coaches can always bring leadership, I think, but a leader in game, a leader to the players too, I think is very important in a roster. So I think between malleable rookie talent and veterancy, there needs to be a balance. And I think, for Overwatch 2, a lot of teams are going for a smaller lineup, right? Because I think especially last season, a smaller lineup was really good because there was just no way to practice outside of scrims. There was no ranked. You just had 5 players on the roster, and if you just had 5 players and they'd play all the time, they'd get much more experience than a team with like 9 players that had to split like playtime, right? So I think especially last season, these really small rosters were really valuable. But I would say this season, I think a lot of teams are still going to go for a very small roster. But I also personally feel if a bench is well managed, then a 7, 8 player roster can also very much work just to bring flexibility, just to bring expertise, and to bring different playstyles and different metas. Because a lot of people look at players in a way where, oh, they're good at this character, they're good at this character, but they don't look at players in a way where their personality is aggressive or their personality is defensive. And based on that, they might be better at a character in one given meta, but they might not be as good in another given meta. I'll take Shock, for example, again, because of course I'm on that team. We had Kalush, who is really good in a slow Winston meta because he's very good at counter diving and playing passive and not taking damage and enabling the team. And yet we played Mikey in the finals because he's more aggressive, and we felt against Dallas, if we're going to play that passive style, their cooldown usage is just going to be better. So then we should play Mikey, and he's been performing better and better, just because he brings that aggressive impact to the team, where he makes the enemy team react instead of us having to react, right? And I think that really depends meta to meta. I think some metas passive play is way better, and some metas aggressive play. So I think instead of just looking at players like, oh, he can play this character, he can play that character, I think it's also important to look at this player's preferred play style is aggressive or passive, and that's what we need in this meta.
Makes sense. Now, one interesting position that, of course, changed last season is the tank position. And there, I think across the league, we had pretty different approaches. Teams like Seoul, teams like Atlanta, or even the Mayhem, they went with one tank and generally had them play everything. And arguably, that was a little bit nerfed because their players that had their particular role, let's say a main tank, couldn't grind the off tanks because, that wasn't the same experience. Theoretically, those types of teams now get an upgrade. On the flip side, we have the two finals teams. Those guys had, you and the Fuel had two different tanks. I would argue that ended up being a huge boon for the Fuel specifically, because yes, of course, if you have a Hanbin meta, I think that's also not bad for them. But the fact that they had Fearless, had they not had Fearless, I'm not sure if they're winning this year, right? So where do you fall? Do you need two tanks going into the season 6?
It really depends. It depends on the tank you have. I think, of course, everybody wants a tank that can play everything to a super high level, right? But there's just not that many of those. Most tanks will still either be good at main tank or off tank. So I think unless it's a very special case where you have such an expertise main tank